Good evening, everyone. It is said that culture revolution under Mao, I think it's really great and successful. Because it is really great and successful, how means because culture revolution was successful, killing at least 1 million Tibetans and destroying at least 6,000 ancient monasteries and monuments. It is true that Mao did not care human lives. I think Mao is more heinous and he has a less heart even to compare to the Nazi regime, the Hitler. So, Professor, this is one version. And even today in China, say in Beijing, like for example, Professor, you are able to speak about the communism in New York, this one, university. But if you give the same lecture about the capitalism or about the democracy in Beijing, I think what will be the situation? Last year, so many Tibetans, they rose up about the issue of Tibet. A Tibetan horseman, he said about the return of Dalai Lama, about the freedom of speech. Thundu Wangchen recently, he made a documentary movie called Jigdel Fearless, which you can see in YouTube even now. And he was arrested. Can you please give some light on those issues? Thank you so much.
Well, thanks for...
What about Gulag?
Wait.
Yeah. Well, thanks for coming out and raising your question. I mean, first of all, in terms of Tibet, 1 million people were not killed in Tibet. The population data, if you look at the population in Tibet, at the beginning of the Cultural Revolution, at the end of the Cultural Revolution, there is no decline in the population in Tibet. And I defy you to present that data, to actually present statistical data that shows that 1 million people were killed in Tibet. That is not true. And in fact, the policy of Mao and of the socialist revolution in China was to improve the conditions, the life conditions in Tibet, to improve conditions in which at the start of the Chinese Revolution, 70% of the Tibetan population was infected by venereal disease. This was a society that was mired in backwardness, in which some 700 families controlled about 93% of the land. 700 Lamist and non-Lamist aristocratic families controlled 90% of the land. This was a society in which you had serfs, in which you had slaves, in which people were subjected to the despotic rule of the Lamist monasteries, right, that controlled and destroyed the lives of people. That was the nature. This was not a Shangri-La in Tibet. This was a society that was a brutal theocracy in which illiteracy was widespread, in which women, had no rights whatsoever, and in which the majority of the labor force were serfs. They were bonded laborers. The majority of that society were serfs. And the revolution transformed that situation. Now, we can spend a lot of time talking about what happened, but on the specific question of the destruction of monasteries during the Cultural Revolution, I do want to commend to people's attention a book by Mo Bo-Gao called The Battle Over China's Past. And he has a chapter on the policies of the Cultural Revolution towards Tibet. And he makes several points. One, it was a very complex struggle during the Cultural Revolution as that impacted Tibet. That was a struggle that was both against the old customs, what were called the Four Olds, the old customs, the old habits, the old culture, and the old mores. The old Four Olds, and these were enslaving. These were customs and habits and culture that subordinated women, that kept people in a position in which they couldn't question authority, in which there was the tyranny of the family and the clan. And in Tibet, It was a very complicated struggle to, on the one hand, recognize the national rights of the Tibetan minority. That is, one of the things that happened during the socialist revolution is that language instruction was expanded so that the Tibetan language, there were Tibetan typewriters that were created through the Chinese Revolution, which literacy campaigns, in which the traditional medicines and herbs and things like that were studied and combined with modern things. And schools were built, roads were constructed. These things happened. And at the same time, during the Cultural Revolution, there was struggle against the old influences. And some of the Red Guards, and these were Tibetan Red Guards, attacked the monasteries, attacked the old storehouses of wealth. Those things were condemned by the revolutionary leadership, and those relics and those cultural institutions and artifacts, and this is described in the Bobokal book, they were ultimately protected from this kind of destruction and desecration. But there was a mass upheaval in Tibet during the Cultural Revolution. Young people, Tibetans, not Hans, but Tibetans, rose up against the influence of the old. And there were great changes that took place in Tibet in this period. But to tell me that 1 million people were killed, I defy you to produce that, because the population data, in fact, the Chinese government had a different population policy where they were encouraging birth control throughout Chinese society, encouraging birth control and making contraceptives available so that women could become full participants in society. In places like Tibet and Xinjiang province, there were efforts made to encourage, the growth of those populations because they had been traditionally decimated by the poverty that had prevailed in those societies. But there were not 1 million people who were killed in Tibet. This is totally untrue.